All right. Well, cool, David. Thanks for sitting down and talking with me. I got connected with David through Talk About Doubts and Apologetics Ministry we're both a part of. He was also mentioned in a previous conversation I had with Brett as one of the most aggressive readers Brett knew. And I can say that David is the most aggressive reader I know. Uh, I feel like on Facebook, I'm seeing a new book that you're conquering every few days. So I thought it'd be fun to have you on, just have you talk a little bit about yourself and then kind of your tips for intellectually engaging with the faith as a reader and kind of what your habits look like, and then get into what you've been learning about lately. And yeah, just keep it casual, keep it fun. So do you want to maybe start off with introducing yourself besides just the best dressed person at the Talk About Doubts weekend retreat?
I don't know about all that. Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot that's interesting about me. I used to be kind of active in the YouTube sphere. I had a channel called Faith Because of Reason, which is, I mean, it's still up. I have some of my older apologetic content up on there. But that was kind of where I started in the apologetics world. Kind of got my toes in the theology world, joined the Society of Evangelical Arminians, and I'm still a member there, occasionally engage in the theology debates there. I've been asked by Jonathan McLatchie to join the team and talk about doubt, so I do some apologetics work there. And I mean, I'm the host of the Christian Evidentialism podcast, where we just kind of discuss mostly apologetic and philosophy of religion topics, but also occasionally theology and such, all from a Christian evidentialist point of view. So those are some areas that I'm involved in.
Cool. And then for anyone not familiar with the terms, just what's your quick, like 1 minute explanation of a Christian evidentialist?
Somebody who holds to the doctrines of the Orthodox Christian faith plus an evidentialist epistemology, which I'll just define basically as the idea that a person's beliefs ought to be proportioned to the quality of their evidence.
Cool. You have that ready, bro. Nice. Well, cool. So I know the David Pallman that is devouring books and is super engaged in all these theological and apologetic topics and stuff, but kind of what happened before that? Did you grow up Christian? Were you always pretty intellectually engaged with it? What did that look like?
So I was raised in a denomination known as the Independent Fundamental Baptists. My father pastors in that denomination. So, yeah, I mean, I was essentially raised Christian, but anyone who knows anything about the Independent Fundamental Baptists knows that they are not, they don't, I'm trying to think how I can put this nicely. They don't encourage the development of loving God with all your mind. They're what some people might call an anti-intellectual wing of Christianity.
Gotcha.
So, fortunately, my parents weren't at like the most extreme end of that, so we weren't like overtly forbidden from asking questions or
Mm-hmm.
reading apologetic material, but it was not encouraged, and if you sort of went into directions that they weren't comfortable with, then they would let you know about it. So I don't come from a background that encouraged the sort of stimulation of the mind or taking one's faith seriously in a academic capacity. I do remember, hearing scholarship kind of talked about in derogatory ways and such in many
Mm.
sermons and stuff growing up. So definitely didn't come from a background where that was something that was promoted or anything like that. But it was a Christian background.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, there's never a time where like I didn't believe the doctrines of the Christian faith. But yeah, when I was probably around 18, 19, maybe even a little earlier, maybe when I was 17, I started having some doubts and questions about God's existence, whether the
Mm.
Bible was true. It started out with little things, right? Like Bible contradictions, right? How can, if this is a word of God, how can we've got, issues like this? And eventually, I just started questioning, well, what reasons do I have for thinking it's the word of God in the first place? In fact, what reasons do I even have for thinking that God exists? And I
Mm.
wasn't real satisfied with the kinds of answers I was getting in the environment I was in. So that kind of forced me to dig a little bit deeper. At first, I started out with, stuff like Ken Ham books and Josh McDowell stuff, and
Mhm.
I didn't find that really persuasive. Uh, I read a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and one good thing about Strobel is that he interviews different people throughout the book, and so that
Mhm.
connected me with a lot of names, people like William Lane Craig or Gary Habermas, Craig Blomberg, and so I discovered kind of the more intellectual side of Christian apologetics largely through that book. And I hated reading, I really did. I hated it in school, but I had to learn to do it because I was being plagued by so many questions, and I needed
Right.
answers. And the only way I could get the answers was to do the research myself, because just again the environment I was in, I wasn't really allowed online, so I wasn't able to like connect with people through the internet. And in
Interesting.
my own church sphere, people just these sorts of questions, it was frowned upon to ask them. So I had to essentially become a reader. And so it was, yeah, I would say it was largely my own doubts about the faith that pushed me to the books.
Mm, totally. So that's an interesting thing about your restriction to the internet at the time. That was something I didn't know about you. Um, how did that affect kind of your development of an understanding of the apologetics landscape today? Because I feel like a lot of my understanding has come through the internet. So it's interesting hearing about coming into this world in this modern age without it being primarily focused through the internet. I'm interested in kind of how you developed from maybe the case for Christ and things like that into some of these more robust thinkers, like besides just that explicit connection through the case for Christ.
Yeah. So I didn't have like no internet access whatsoever. It was heavily
Mhm.
restricted. So I didn't have social media or anything like that. My parents pretty heavily monitored what my internet activity was, so if I
Mhm.
was, going anywhere that they didn't like or weren't comfortable with, obviously they know about it. So I kind of wasn't able to like directly be looking up these kinds of questions, because then they would know I was questioning things, right? So I didn't want them to know that. So, but one thing they were okay with was if I would buy books. So I would usually like
Mm.
go to eBay, go to Amazon, and just kind of look up books by, the names of or authors, whose names I'd come across just through reading other apologetic books. And these
Mhm.
books would contain references to other books, and so I was really able to kind of expand my knowledge through there. But most of the books were like focused on like new atheism and stuff, so I kind of came
Mhm.
into this like maybe 10 or 20 years behind maybe where the conversation's at now. So
Mm.
I really had yeah, I would say it would probably look different from the current landscape, in that I thought there was like a lot more discussion going on of new atheism and stuff. That's not to say we don't have any of that going on in apologetics anymore, but it's not a hot button issue anymore. We're not coming across like tons of books on new atheism anymore. So kind of
Mm.
my impression was, oh, this is the big deal. We got to know how to fight with the new atheists, because I was, reading books from like the early 2000s, was just, when you kind of got this big bang of apologetic literature. So probably that's one sense my apologetic knowledge or understanding of the territory there was a little behind.
Gotcha. And then another thing I'm interested in is um, kind of in rebelling against this your environment of that anti-intellectualism. And I also know you've come to embrace some different theological points from your upbringing. So were a lot of those changes kind of happening at the same time as your beefing up of confidence in general Christianity, or were they pretty separate and they weren't colliding too much?
At first they were fine, right? It was just like evidence for God's existence, no real problems there. So
Mhm.
initially there weren't a whole lot of issues. Stuff started cropping up when I started coming into the issue of the textual reliability of the New Testament in particular. The
Mhm.
reason for that was because my denomination was strongly King James only. They
Mhm.
believed you could only use the King James version of the Bible, and that all other versions were, they would call them perversions of the devil, right? Um, And so as I'm looking into issues of like textual reliability, I'm reading like books by Bart Ehrman, right? His famous book, Misquoting Jesus. And I'm coming across these challenges that like there are these parts of the Bible that aren't original, or that were interpolations, things that were added in later. And this is stuff that it's well known in scholarship, right? Like the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, the last 12 verses of Mark, uh, you know so these were but I'd never encountered this before, these kinds of claims. And so then I was like, well, I'll read what I always did is I would read the evangelical scholars. So I came across people like Dan Wallace. And what was surprising to me is that they agreed that these parts were not original. And so then
Mm.
I started having an issue with my King James onlyism, because the King James Bible has the last 12 verses of Mark, and it has the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. And in most modern King James Bibles, at any rate, there's no like notation to the reader that this isn't in your earliest manuscripts. I know a lot
Gotcha.
of modern Bible versions will have that, but that was definitely not in the Bibles that we were reading, because they didn't like us to know about textual criticism and things like that.
Mm.
So that's kind of was the first issue where my apologetic research began colliding with some of the beliefs I'd been taught. And it only got worse from there. But yes, to answer your question, eventually the two did come to a head together.
Gotcha. Super interesting. Well, I want to go back to the reading focus now. I'm interested to hear that you actually started as hating reading. That shocks me now. I think I've always felt in a different class of reader than you and a lot of the other guys I'm seeing, because it seems like there's just this like deep joy for reading that's always been there. So it's interesting to hear that you've started out hating that. So what initially, what were the changes that you made that turned you into more of a reader in the early stages? Because I'm assuming if you hated it before, it was really just that need for these questions, like you said before, that drew you into that. But what made you kind of make that transition to the reading maniac we all know and love now?
I mean, I guess if anything, it was more or less kind of the success of having the questions answered, is I guess how I would put that. So there were just a lot of ways I looked for answers to my initial questions, and it was through reading books that I had the most success gaining answers. And kind of one thing, as you kind of look into matters of faith and worldview and such, is for every like one question you answer, you discover, oh, there's more questions. And so it always snowballs. So in that sense, there's always then just more motivation to read, right? And you just
Mm,
discover that there's more issues, and eventually, it dawns on you, you're just not gonna live long enough to answer all your questions, and so you just gotta prioritize the most important ones. So
mm,
that was one thing that kept me motivated. But I guess what gave me a love for it is I just developed a love for learning through it. I
mm,
actually learn to enjoy what I was learning, to apply, and even eventually to be able to help others with what I was learning. These were all
mm,
just really great motivating factors that actually caused me to start enjoying reading. I mean, it didn't happen like overnight. It just
right.
as I stayed with it over a few years, eventually, actually, I came to enjoy it. And there's things you can do. I mean, you got to figure out what works for you. I
Mm,
find actually I do a lot, but I used to try to always like save all my reading for the end of the day when I was done with work and stuff. It was
mm.
a really bad idea. I find
Really?
out like it's much better to do your reading early in the morning. And like I would tell myself I'm not a morning person, but in reality, I just had to go to bed earlier, and so give up my night owl days. So there's going to be a bit of a finding what works for you with
Right.
reading. Not trying to force yourself to do it after you've been working all day or whatever. But
Mm,
yeah, I mean, there's no magic bullet, no way to just flip a switch and make yourself love it. But for
right.
me, it was something that developed over time, and I gained additional motivations through seeing the benefits of it.
Gotcha. So then in the beginning, did you kind of go straight into like, all right, I want to be reading every morning, like super intense, things like that? Or was it a more gradual, like, all right, a couple days a week, and then yeah, what'd that look like?
So I was, I'm going to give away some secrets here. Uh, so I was I was a little bit of a naughty boy in church sometimes, and I didn't always like to listen to the preaching because it was boring sometimes, at least in my estimation. So what I would do is I would take my books and I'd put them inside my Bible case and I'd bring them to church with me. And then kind of during the church services, I figured, I mean, I'm stuck here anyway, right? So I would sometimes, I got a lot of reading. Excuse me, I got a lot of reading done during church services. I really don't recommend that to people, but that was one way I started doing it, so I felt like I wasn't wasting time. But yeah, I mean, I would do it, especially like if I was just, I was having a day where I was just really wrestling with some questions or something. Why do I think God exists? Then that would kind of motivate me to do it. So yeah, I mean, it was as I could.
Mm, very cool. I love it. So then if you were encountering someone, definitely not me, who wants to be taking reading more seriously and cultivating some good habits for that, what are kind of your key starting points that you wish you would have known at the beginning?
Let's see. So, well, one important thing is prioritizing the topics that you want to study.
Mhm.
So nobody's you're not gonna read something if you're not interested in it. So you gotta pick
Mm,
topics that are interesting to you, prioritize, kind of the order. Now, sometimes you have to shift your order because you find out here's a topic I'm interested in, but in order to understand it, I need some level of familiarity with another topic. So
mm,
sometimes there's some shifting in priorities. So kind of whatever your whether physical or mental priority list of topics to study is, it's got to be a little bit open to fluctuation. But you should have a general like trajectory to your study that kind of gives you some structure so that you know where you're going.
mm,
In terms of having the motivation to do it, I mentioned finding a time that works for you. So for me, it's just a lot fresher when I wake up in the morning. I can read
mm,
faster. I can read more than I can at the end of the day. So, I mean, you got to know yourself. You got to have a time for it that works for you. Make it enjoyable for yourself. Like I just have, I have my morning coffee while I'm doing it, and I like coffee. So if you prefer something else, then you can drink that while you're reading. But make it enjoyable for yourself,
mm,
and then have people in your life that you can discuss it with, right? Like friends. If you,
mm,
I've never been a big fan of book clubs, but for people who are, if that is helpful to motivate you, being able to discuss the material is a great motivator for wanting to read it and be familiar with it. So
mm,
that's another way that you can do it. One thing I used to do is back when I was making videos on my YouTube channel, I would, kind of as I was writing the script for the video, I would do a lot of reading for that. And so kind of that
mm.
was a motivator, is that I have this project I'm working on. So I'm doing
Gotcha.
reading for that. So that can be something that, helps motivate you. Ultimately, it's just you gotta stick to it.
Mm,
If you're really like just you've read like 10 pages and you've got nothing, then maybe you just need to stop for the day. But I mean, usually you can go, you can press on if you're still getting things out of it, and so you'll kind of train yourself to have some endurance.
mm,
One thing that I found is, especially if you're trying to get into more, let's say, academic literature, one thing that
mhm,
helps is if you read two books at a time, not at the same time, but have an academic book and kind of an easier book. And so kind of as you're reading through the more technical material, you're going to go through it slower. It's technical material, right? So you might
mhm,
only get like 5-6 pages in, and you just be exhausted. Then you can still read the popular level book, so you're still learning, you're still gaining information. You'll be able to
mm,
read more of it, and you're going to like feel like you're making more progress compared to the difficult material. And it gives your mind some variety, so that actually in the end you can end up reading a lot more. So that's
mm,
one trick, is to actually be reading two books at a time, one that's more technical and one that's less technical, or books on different topics. So the point is to mix it up so that you're
mhm.
not getting, um, I'm not sure what the word is, but I guess overpowered by like just this one thing, or getting bored of it. Because I mean, we're human beings. We like variety, we like freshness, we
Right.
like what's new. So that's one way to kind of keep it fresh to your mind, and you can actually cover more topics doing it that way.
Mm.
That might be, yeah, those are some tricks, some tips. Ultimately, again, different things are going to work for you, so you'll have to kind of just trial and error, find out what works best for you. But those are some of
Mm.
my own personal aids for helping me read.
Gotcha. I'm curious now about your like note taking and general retention of what you read too. Like just at a high level, what does your note taking process look like? How do you keep what you learn to stick? I'm interested to see why you're smiling right now. Yeah, give us the rundown.
Okay, so I don't take notes. And
Okay.
I have a long-standing saying that the unpardonable sin is writing in your book. So I like my books to be like pristine. I don't like if I buy a used book and it has writing in it, that's grounds for World War III. You know what I'm saying? I just
Nice.
I don't like writing in my books. And I really don't like other people writing in my books. And so yeah, if I ever loan you a book and you write in it, there will be blood. So
I was just gonna say completely unrelated. Can I borrow a couple books from you?
only if you don't write in them.
Cool.
So yeah, more or less, I actually retain well if I read out of a physical copy of a book. So I'll
Okay.
retain approximately 70 to 80% of what I read if I read out of a physical book. If I read off of a screen, it's going to be more like 50%. So this is why I'm not like a big fan of reading Kindle or PDFs or whatever. If you can retain off of those, that's great because it saves you space and it saves you money. I
Mhm.
can't. I have to have physical books, and I mean that comes out in my library. So I
Plus,
just
then what would you post on Facebook if you're reading on Kindle, right?
that's all. I mean, I could I guess do like screenshots or something, but it's boring. You know, it's boring. Uh, yeah, no. So I'm very much a physical book guy,
Yeah.
but you know, like I said, I am envious of the people who can actually retain off of screens because sometimes, in fact, often it's almost always cheaper to buy the books that way, and you don't have to deal with so much shelf space like I do. So there
Right.
are advantages to it, but just to me, being able to retain more is worth it. Now, what I typically do at the end of a study is I usually write my own conclusions out in like essay form or a series of essays, and
Mhm.
I just argue for my own position. And I'll, cite the books that were the most helpful that I read on it in my own argument. And so that kind of it helps me organize my own thoughts on it. It helps
Mhm.
me just kind of remember where the things are in the book. And if I ever want to sort of refresh my memory, these are my own thoughts on it. So they just your own thoughts make the most sense to you.
Mhm.
So that's a way to help me, stay fresh on it. So I don't exactly take notes as I go, but I do sort of write my thoughts down at the end of the study when I feel like I've thought through it thoroughly, and that's when I'm going to be the most clear, and I'll have all the sources there if I need to find this information again. So that's more or less that's the closest I get to note taking.
Gotcha. Cool. I appreciate that. I'm curious, what has been either the top book or maybe the top few books that have changed your mind in the biggest way, like throughout all your studies?
Let's see. It's really hard to choose between Tim McGrew's two books, The Foundations of Knowledge and Internalism and Epistemology, because the two of them, like, they're on like the same kind of topics, and I look at like one as being a continuation of the other. Like they're both on
Mm.
epistemology, so it's just sort of like him building his full theory of knowledge. So I almost look at them
Mhm.
as like the
Right.
same, but really hard to overestimate the influence Tim McGrew's books have had on me,
Mm.
just in terms of my own thinking,
Right.
because they deal with like all the foundational level epistemic stuff that affects everything else in study. So it's hard for them to sort of not affect my own thinking when I read any other book, particularly a argumentative book that's trying to argue for a thesis. Then I'm sort of assessing how well justified are the premises of these arguments. Does the conclusion actually follow from them? And it was largely Tim McGrew who helped me to think properly about that. So
Mm.
in that sense, I don't know if they made me change my mind. I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but they
But it like
definitely,
developed you.
yeah, but it trained me how to think properly about things. So yeah, had a big influence on me in that sense.
Gotcha. Very cool. So then what would be your top 5 books of all time then? I'm assuming those two are on there.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And of course, if I don't say the Bible, somebody's gonna get on me if I don't say the Bible. So yes, we'll have to make the Bible number
Okay.
one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's difficult to say for any one topic. I really
Mm,
like Joshua Rasmussen's book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth. That was an influential book for me. Another one by Joshua Rasmussen and Alex Proust would be Necessary Existence, is a really sophisticated argument for God's existence, contingency argument for God's existence. That's got to be one of my favorites.
mm,
Um, and let's see, it's really hard to pick. Not
okay.
because not because I don't know of one. It's just there's so many I want to include on this list.
Right, right.
Um, maybe In Defense of Pure Reason by Lawrence Bonjour was another one that I really enjoyed. So
Cool.
I'm weird though, so I like these kind of niche books. But these are the kind of questions that like I thought about, and these were the books that like answered them and kind of gave me peace and direction on these issues. So
Mm,
that's why they're important books to me. But I would completely understand if like they aren't for somebody else. So I get that these are not everybody's books.
cool, cool. And then I'm curious, what are you reading now?
Oh, I got a stack of books, but kind of the one that I'm most recently been reading is called it's called Faith and Reason: Three Views. It's one of the IVP, sort of like the Zondervan counterpoints, but it's
Hmm.
IVP's version of that, where you've got multiple contributors all representing a different perspective, and they all get to write, rebuttals and rejoinders to each other.
Right. Very cool.
What about you? Are you reading anything?
I am. I'm reading a few things. I'm reading Marriage and Sexuality in the Early Church by David Hunter. I just had a call with him last week. Um, I had reached out to you about that. The First Corinthians 7 has always been just a super interesting passage to me on what really seems like Paul asserting um, this superiority of singleness. So then David Hunter's book is a compilation of kind of the first 300-400 years of, I think, just about all of the early church fathers mentioning and writing on the topic, which has been super interesting because I think, assumed a strong consensus in there, and there's definitely this prominent theme of the superiority of celibacy. But there's a lot more nuance to it than I had given the fathers credit for. So that's been interesting. And then I'm also reading When the Son of Man Didn't Come, The Delay of the Parousia, talking about Jesus' prophecies of returning in the first century. You're familiar with that?
Oh yes.
Yeah, it's been a really, really good read so far. Do you have thoughts?
I do, but I won't get on. I won't get into a preterism discussion here on it. But maybe another time.
Cool, cool. We'll have you back to talk about how once I finish the book, we'll hop on and talk about it.
Oh goodness, I'll probably have to go refresh it. It's been so many years since I've looked into the eschatology debate, but yes, I am familiar with that book.
Cool, fun, awesome, man. Well, cool. Well, people are interested in follow along with your writing and learning and stuff like that. How can they keep track of what you're doing?
Let's see. Ordinarily, I would have said you could follow it on my YouTube channel, but again, I haven't done anything with that in probably over a year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're really interested, then you can always friend me on Facebook because that's where I'm probably the most
I can
consistent.
highly recommend that. David's got some really good. I think your short form posts are super valuable. Like when you'll get on and just give your thoughts on a topic in a few paragraphs, I'm always really enriched by those. I want to commend you on those. So I highly recommend it, even just for those alone.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that my rambling thoughts have helped to somebody. But that I would say that's probably where I kind of the most consistent. I should probably start like a blog or something at some point where I can post like more essay length
Mhm.
and kind of extend my thoughts on things a bit more, but I'm just too lazy to do it. Probably sooner or later I'll start a Christian evidentialism blog. Occasionally I'll post on Tim Stratton's website, Free Thinking Ministries. I've written articles for him. I'm working on one on free will right now, which might get posted over there because I know he's a big proponent of free will. But yeah, those are probably the main places I would say people could stay up with what I'm studying.
Cool. Well, David, thank you so much for just sitting down and chatting with me. I appreciate it. Again, massive admiration for just your tenacity and reading and learning and stuff like that. And every time I come across on your Facebook post, I'm like, yeah, I probably should do some reading today. So thank you for encouraging me and others in that, and for coming on just to chat for a little bit.
Oh yeah, man, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, totally.